Galatians 3:28. There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. So my family in Jamaica, they're all good, solid Christians, devout Christians. Sometimes I think all they do is study the Bible. So when I come home to Jamaica and I talk about the black church, they're like, black church? What about this passage in Galatians? I mean, how could there be a black church and a white church? Aren't we all one in Jesus? Doesn't he get rid of all of these racial differences? You might be asking yourself the same question, or maybe you don't even know that there's a black church, that there are 7 historically black denominations. But what I want to do today is to take a walk through history, to look at how the black church came into being and why it continues to exist. And I want to start in the middle of the 18th century, right after the Revolutionary War, and then make a huge leap forward, come to the middle of the 20th century, around the time of the Civil Rights Movement, and then come up to the 21st century, okay? So it's really the moral leadership of white Christians that has a huge role to play in the beginning of the black church. It's a great awakening, which in the early part of the 18th century has this massive evangelistic outreach throughout the South. And there are itinerant preachers, primarily Methodists and Baptists, who are reaching out to enslaved people. And prior to this, the slaves had really resisted the idea of being evangelized. They'd resisted the idea of Christianity. But this kind of Christianity spoke to them. This idea of a Jesus who was a liberator. And so what you found coming out of the Great Awakening was that Christianity was having a subversive impact. Slaveholders were resisting the notion of having their enslaved people evangelized because converted slaves were preaching to black and white alike. They were violating the codes of white supremacy. In fact, slaves were operating on terms of equality with whites. One slaveholder spoke of one of his slaves saying, he was raised in a family of religious persons, commonly called Methodists, and has lived with some of them for years past, on terms of perfect equality. The refusal to continue him on these terms had led to the man escaping slavery. In fact, slaves were accepted into full fellowship in Baptist and Methodist churches. And black people, both slave and free, were allowed to teach and preach. In one case, Methodists actually paid the price for a slave to go free because he was such a powerful preacher, and they wanted to release him to follow his ministry. And some white churches elected to have black pastors, some of them even still slaves. But even more profound than the fact that slaves were being treated as equals and being allowed to preach and their freedom being purchased, many of these Christians actually opposed the institution of slavery itself. John Wesley, the founder of the Methodists, would not allow slaveholders to be members of the church. And later this issue would lead to a split in 3 denominations, the Methodists, the Presbyterians, and the Baptists, around the time of the Civil War. But by the end of the Revolutionary War, so back in the middle of the 18th century, contradictions had arisen. And Methodists had reversed Wesley's prohibition on slaveholders joining the church. Right after the Revolutionary War, the state of Pennsylvania enacts gradual abolition. So slaves are gradually being freed, and they're flooding into the city of Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. When they get there, you think they're going to be met with open arms, right? People are happy. Look, this is a time of revolution. But that's not what's happening. No. When they get there, they're met with rising hostility. They're poor, They can barely find work. In many cases, they're actually indentured into servanthood. And worse yet, the very evangelicals, the Methodists and the Baptists who had been so instrumental in the Great Awakening, now they won't even minister to these freed people. They won't evangelize them. They won't allow them to operate as equals in their fellowships as they had been doing. Even the Quakers, who were staunch abolitionists, wouldn't allow slaves or freed people to participate as equals in their meetings. Well, one of the freed men coming into Philadelphia was Richard Allen, and he had been evangelized or awakened, as the term was at the time, by the Methodists. And he joins the main Methodist church in Philadelphia, St. George's. And he is a powerful preacher. So they allow him at St. George's to preach every morning at 5 a.m., and he's preaching to his brothers and sisters, to the freed people whom the evangelicals were ignoring. And he's not only preaching at 5 o'clock in the morning, he's going out into the park, he's preaching multiple times a day, and he is beginning to build a following of blacks at St. George's. But the contradictions ran deep, because now white people are beginning to grumble that, in fact, they don't want black people mixing with them as equals. They don't want interracial mixing. And so, you know, blacks are contributing to the coffers of St. George's. St. George's builds a gallery, basically a balcony. And with this balcony, which is partially built with black money, is so that the church services may be segregated. Black people are going to sit upstairs and not even going to be allowed on the floor in the main sanctuary. And already they had been pushed out of this. So in those days, people sat in the same pews. You know, they had assigned pews. They'd been pushed out of where they used to sit to the edges of the church. And on the morning, soon after this gallery is completed, Richard Allen leads a group of black people into the church, and they go to their usual seats, and they kneel to pray, because that's a stage, you know, everybody's kneeling in prayer, only to find that one of the white trustees is pulling Reverend Absalom Jones to his feet. And he says, no, let us just finish praying. But they insist. Another man comes over to help move these black people in the middle of the service up to the segregated balcony. At that point, the prayer was over, and Richard Allen leads all of them out of St. George's, never to return. So the roots of the black church lie in the contradictions and hypocrisy of the white church. What is more, these white trustees at St. George's are so insistent that blacks should submit to them that they pursue, Richard Allen and these black Methodists found Bethel Methodist Church. And they're so determined that these black Bethelites, the members of Bethel, should submit that they pursue them over 2 decades to get control of the church. First of all, they tricked them into signing articles of incorporation, which would actually give St. George's control over Bethel. And then, since they have control, they get the city of Philadelphia to put the church building where Bethel met up for auction. But God was on the side of Richard Allen, and he was able to make the winning bid and buy back his own church building. That's only one of many tricks. Finally, they take Bethel to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, suing for control of the church. Except to their astonishment, the Supreme Court finds for Bethel and declares that they are independent from the Methodist Conference, recognizes them as a freestanding church. Whereupon Richard Allen calls together black Methodists up and down the East Coast, from Massachusetts, from New York, from New Jersey, from Maryland, because what was happening in Philadelphia was not extraordinary, but rather it was the rule. Especially in Baltimore, they had had exactly the same experience with white Methodists. And these black Methodists come together, and in 1816, they found the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And that's the first black denomination, which arises because of the inconsistency of the white church. And the AME church denomination is only the first of many black denominations which are founded by black people, in many cases as a result of the racism of whites. But that was a really long time ago. That was over 200 years ago. You know, after that, slaves are freed, civil rights movement. Why on earth are blacks and whites still basically not worshiping in integrated churches? Well, let's hop over 200 years, come up to the civil rights movement. The middle of the 20th century, about 70 years ago, where there are two southern civil religions at war. At least that's the way Andrew Mannis, historian and Baptist pastor, puts it. Two southern civil religions in conflict. By civil religion, he means this blend of biblical principles and American traditions, American values, which are shaping both personal values and public behavior. So as the civil rights movement is kicking off in the 50s, and black people are calling for an end to segregationist terror, the white Southern Baptists are responding by claiming that their religion and their social arrangements, the ones that prevail in the South, are really the model for the United States, and that they should be spread across the United States, and not just the United States, but indeed they see this as a model for the world, because in their opinion, their version of Christianity is the most valid expression of the faith in the world. And for them, this is fundamentally about the spread of Jim Crow segregation. The two in their minds are as one. They justify their passion for segregation on religious grounds. They claimed that God had mandated segregation, citing scripture. And they argue that Jesus and other biblical figures were themselves segregationists. Sad to say that the most passionate and effective defenders of segregation were ministers, the ones who were seen as having expertise in the ultimate definitions of reality. And their position was, God is on our side. They saw the Southern tradition of segregation as sacred because to them it was inherent to the American tradition, and that was a sacred experiment. But there was another civil religion at work in the South. Black Baptists also appealed both to religion and to the traditions of the United States in defending the end of segregation. They appealed to equality as a God-given right, and to the Constitution and the claim that all men are created equal. Black Baptists, in particular Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., saw their people as chosen by God to redeem the soul of America, to really call America to live up to our highest values, and to be a model to the world, not of segregation, but of how people of different races could live together in peace, respect, and justice. And they framed an end to racial hostility in messianic terms. Reverend Ralph Abernathy, one of the civil rights leaders, evoked powerful biblical images to describe the vision of the civil rights movement, saying it was the lion lying down with the lamb, that every valley would be exalted, and people would study war no more with the end of segregation. And they saw God at work in every one of the civil rights victories. What I'd like to do to illustrate this is to use the powerful words of Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. himself. Let me give you a little background. In Birmingham, where segregation is being practiced so that black people can't drink from the same fountains and they can't eat at the same lunch counters, and they can't shop in the same stores, and they can't be served in the same restaurants. In the face of all of this injustice, Black people in Birmingham begin a protest campaign. And they call Dr. King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference to come to Birmingham to help with this campaign, in response to which the police turn their dogs on these people. They're being attacked. They're being jailed. They're being beaten in jail. And what's the response of the white church? 8 white pastors issue a public statement calling for an end to nonviolent protest. Not calling for an end to segregation, not calling an end to people being attacked by police dogs, calling for an end to nonviolent protest. King was among those who had been jailed for these protests, and he was profoundly disappointed that white pastors spoke out against protests but didn't denounce the underlying injustice that had provoked them. So I hope you'll permit me to read to you extensively from his lengthy letter written from a Birmingham jail. Dr. King wrote, "I've been disappointed with the white church and its leadership. Of course, there's some notable exceptions, and he lists them. I want to suggest a couple of others that he didn't list. One is Reverend William Sloane Coffin of Yale University, who was arrested as a freedom rider protesting against interstate transportation segregation. And another, this would happen 2 years later, is Reverend James Reeb, a pastor from Boston, who was murdered by segregationists in Salem when he was participating in the Salem to Montgomery marches. But King goes on, "Despite these notable exceptions, I must reiterate honestly that I've been disappointed with the church. I had a strange feeling when I was suddenly catapulted into the leadership of the bus protest in Montgomery several years ago that we would have the support of the white church. I felt that some white ministers, priests, and rabbis of the South would be some of our strongest allies. Instead, some few have been outright opponents, refusing to understand the freedom movement and misrepresenting its leaders. All too many others have been more cautious than courageous. In spite of my shattered dreams of the past, I came to Birmingham with the hope that white religious leadership of this community would see the justice of our cause and with deep moral concern serve as the channel through which our just grievances could get to the power structure. I had hoped that each of you would understand, but again, I've been disappointed. I've heard numerous religious leaders of the South call upon their worshipers to comply with a desegregation decision because it is the law. But I have longed to hear white ministers say, follow this decree because integration is morally right, and the Negro is our brother. In the midst of blatant injustices inflicted upon the Negro, I've watched white churches stand on the sidelines and merely mouth pious irrelevancies and sanctimonious trivialities. In the midst of a mighty struggle to rid our nation of racial and economic injustice, I've heard so many ministers say, those are social issues which the gospel has nothing to do with. And I've watched so many churches commit themselves to a completely otherworldly religion, which made a strange distinction between bodies and souls, between the sacred and the secular. There was a time when the church was very powerful, King wrote. It was during that period that the early Christians rejoiced when they were deemed worthy to suffer for what they believed. In those days, the church was not merely a thermometer that recorded the ideas and principles of popular opinion. It was a thermostat that transformed the mores of society. Wherever the early Christians entered a town, the power structure got disturbed and immediately sought to convict them for being disturbers of the peace and outside agitators. They brought an end to such ancient evils as infanticide and gladiatorial contest. And in the final paragraph I'll read, King says, "Things are different now. The contemporary church is so often a weak, ineffectual voice with an uncertain sound. It is so often the arch supporter of the status quo. Far from being disturbed by the presence of the church, the power structure of the average community is consoled by the church's often vocal sanctions of things as they are." But that's not true anymore, right? We're in the 21st century. That's not the church today. No, the church stands up against racial inequality. The church stands up against economic inequality, right? Well, the answer to that is complicated, according to the research of Michael Emerson and Chris Smith. They found that white evangelicals believe very strongly in individualism. And so they see racism as being about prejudice, about the evil intent of individuals. It's at the level of the individual, and it's at the level of personal relationships. They also found that white evangelicals are very strongly anti-structuralist. That means they reject the idea that social structures like school systems, the job market, or housing market actually affect individual actions and outcomes. And this prevents them from understanding how racism has been transformed, that it no longer has the same form that it did under slavery or even under Jim Crow, that really its most important impact today is structural. What do they mean by social structure? They're really talking about the tracks and channels, the methods for accessing resources which are available in society. So whether that is getting a degree, or getting a profession, or a job on Wall Street, or starting a small business, or whether it's the school system that your children go to, or whether it is your ability to pass on wealth to the next generation. That's all part of social structure. The tax structure impacts whether you can pass on wealth to your to the next generation. It impacts how much of your income you get to take home. It impacts the fact that actually if your income mostly comes from investments, you pay less taxes than the person who is working for a salary. That's social structure. It's the large-scale patterns of interactions between groups of people that impact rates of incarceration or patterns of marriage. And so I want to talk about how social structure is impacted by race, how our society is structured by race. According to Doug Massey, talking about residential segregation, he says almost 1 in 3 blacks living in metropolitan areas experienced hyper-segregation, segregation from other races in 2010. 1 in 3, though that proportion is sharply down from levels in 1970. He goes on to say that whites are only ready to tolerate low levels of integration in their neighborhoods. They have much lower tolerance than, say, blacks do. And that their preference to live far away from blacks is rooted in anti-black stereotypes. What's more, this residential segregation has other impacts on social structure because it leads to important educational inequities. Poor black children living in the inner city just don't have access to the same kind of schools that wealthy whites, upper middle class whites living in wealthy suburbs do. According to Liz Sablik, black students are less likely to be exposed to advanced classes in high school than are whites. They're less likely to complete high school. They have much lower rates of educational attainment. Only 14% earn a BA compared to 31% of whites, even though they may enroll in college at similar rates. And again, social structure plays a role here because there is research that shows that it's actually financial problems that cause a lot of black students to drop out of college. And this poor educational outcome also has negative consequences in terms of unemployment rates. Now, I know that black unemployment rates in the last quarter of 2019 were at all-time lows. But do you know that they're almost twice the rate for white people? And do you know that that's a situation that has endured for over 50 years? That regularly black unemployment rates are almost double the rates for whites. And there's another consequence that's related to poor educational outcomes, and that's income and wealth. So depending on what their level of income was, blacks earned only, say, 68% of what their white peers earned, or all the way down, the poorest blacks, only 54% of what their white peers earned. Like half. Blacks are earning half of what white people are earning. And according to one study, it would take 228 years for the average black family to accumulate as much wealth as the average white family has right now. It would take 228 years for the average black family to earn as much wealth as the average white family has right now. But white evangelicals explain all of this racial economic inequality largely in terms of personal responsibility, according to Emerson and Smith. They found that they relied on individual level explanations for racial inequality. So they saw lack of motivation as being the driving cause. Well over half of white evangelicals, 62% of them, attributed economic differences to lack of motivation among blacks. And this compares to other white people who are only at 51% making the same attribution. So white evangelicals think this much more so even than the rest of the white population. And it compares to black conservative Protestants, where only 1 in 3 of them think that it's about a lack of motivation. Their rate is half the rate of white evangelicals. So let's look at a structural explanation. That is lack of access to high-quality education. Only 1 in 3 white evangelicals attribute racial economic inequality to educational disadvantages. And that compares to other whites, where it's 1 in 2. So for white evangelicals, 1 in 3. Other whites, 1 in 2, think it's because of educational disadvantages. And among conservative black Protestants, it's more than 2 in 3 who think it's because of educational disadvantages. So you could say to me, well, those are just people's opinions. That doesn't mean, the fact that black people don't agree that it's actually a lack of motivation that causes black people to do so poorly doesn't mean that they're right. So let me give you, because I really struggled with how do I help them to see the impact of structure. And Emerson and Smith have a powerful parable that they use. I want to tweak it a little bit. Let's imagine that there are these 2 men. They're both obese. One's black, one's white. And quite surprisingly, they're friends, okay? And they decide that they're going to go and they're going to lose weight. There's this thing called fat away. Sounds good, right? Fat away, I'm for that, okay? They're going to go to Fat Away and they're going to lose weight. What they don't know is that Fat Away is really a research organization. And they're actually testing the effects of different diets, different levels of exercise, different environments on losing weight. So they separate these 2 friends and they send them to different weight loss facilities. And the white guy, when he gets there, he's like, this is kind of strange, because it's really just a cabin in the woods. It's isolated, so he can't talk to his friends, but it's just a cabin in the woods. There's lots of food. It's fast food, junk food, greasy food, lots of desserts. No exercise equipment. No space to run, walk, no weights to lift. And what's more, all the people there are like him. They're overweight and they're not really doing anything to lose any weight. Meanwhile, the black guy arrives at his facility and it is the bomb. There's a gym, there's a track where he can run. If he's into nature, there are trails in the woods where he can walk, and the food is just perfect. It's all delicious, but it's low fat, it's low calorie, there are no sweets, no fatty foods. And all the other people there are slim, and they're all talking about how glad they are that they have their weight under control, and they're encouraging them to exercise. Come, let's run together. So after 2 weeks, these guys get together, and they have to weigh in. And the black guy has lost 5 pounds. And the white guy has put on 2 pounds. And the black guy's like, what's up, bro? Why are you not losing any weight? You're not doing what you're supposed to do. So they separate them. Remember, they don't understand that they're in this experiment. They don't know what each other's experience is like. They come back together in 2 weeks, and they're like, the black guy has lost another 5 pounds, and the white guy has gained 5 pounds. Like, what is going on with you? Same thing happens 2 weeks later. More weight loss for the black guy, more weight gain for the white guy, and the black guy says, what is up with this white dude? He just does not want to lose weight. It's a lack of motivation on his part. Clearly, this is all about him. So if you didn't get the parable, let me belabor it a little. It's really the black people who have the unequal facilities here in the real world, not the white guy. And the weight loss facilities are the segregated neighborhoods where white people have access to high-quality schools, and black kids are struggling in inner-city schools that are terrible. Where white upper-middle-class families have access to travel, tutoring for their kids, great health care, and poor black kids are mostly born to working-class and poor families who don't have any of those advantages. And the weight loss experience represents the persistence of poverty, low educational attainment, and inferior neighborhoods that plague black people. And back to the white church. White Christians are as ignorant of what goes on in the lives of black people and the obstacles they face as the black guy was of what was happening to his white friend at Fataway. It represents the ignorance of the white church. It's what Martin Luther King Jr. called the most segregated hour in America, 11 o'clock on Sunday morning. Because more than 60% of black Christians go to church in historically black denominations. Only 15% go to church in white denominations. And that 15%, I think, blacks are only 11% of the population. So that 15% is a really small number of people spread over a lot of white denominations and a lot of white churches. There are very few black people in any single white church, and no black people in very many white churches. So white Christians don't understand what black people experience. But what about the black church? What's happening with the black church currently? One study of black congregations in Philadelphia by University of Pennsylvania political scientist Ram Kannan and his colleagues found that black churches were located in neighborhoods where residents were poorer, where they experienced more violence, and where they encountered more challenges than any other faith institutions in the city. Confronting these issues in Philadelphia alone, black congregations provided roughly $90 million per annum in services to residents of their neighborhoods. The authors also found that black congregations outperformed white congregations in the provision of social services, even though they were smaller and poorer than white congregations. The authors of this study concluded that the services provided by black congregations contributed in an important way to social stability. They wrote, "One can only imagine how our urban scene would look if these congregations ceased to be providers of care. If such a scenario were to occur, the burden on public services and the social unrest that would follow are hard to imagine." Unlike white Christians, black churches are very aware of the overwhelming challenges that black people face. So what are we to do? Back to my family and the contradiction of the churches divided by race. Surely Jesus calls us to reconciliation. But it can't merely be about interpersonal friendship. I have a friend who works in the field of racial reconciliation, and just last week she talked to me about her white church. She's black, but she goes to this white church out in the suburbs of Boston, wealthy church, wants to reach out to inner city black churches. She said, but the problem that she tried to explain to them, a lot of black churches have been there, done that, hated it. It's not about a conversation. It's about understanding the issues that we face and really engaging those issues, working to change the circumstances. So the first step towards reconciliation is to learn about racial inequalities in the U.S., to understand how institutions influence individual choices and outcomes, the structural nature of the problem. And if you're a Christian, to think prayerfully, and if you're not a Christian, to think about how these inequities can be transformed, not just by treating individuals with kindness and respect, with Christian love, if you're a Christian, but by taking steps to make sure that black people get to go to the same kind of weight loss facility as white people, that black people get the same kinds of schools, neighborhoods, and jobs that whites enjoy. I want to close with another scripture verse, Matthew 25:40. Whatever you do to the least of these, my brothers, you do to me. Whatever we do to the most disadvantaged people, we do to Jesus. If we ignore the heavy burdens that society lays on the shoulders of black people, we ignore the burdens on Jesus. Thank you.